Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Once again, I'm introducing myself because Barry is still out stretching his 7-league boots. He's in Antarctica. Said he'd had it with the cold weather here. So he's going to get out of that. Anyway, he'll be back next time, I think. Next time, by the way, I think is March 5th, Cinco de Marzo. Okay. Welcome and thank you for coming. Last time we finally got into the French Revolution, and things are going to start to happen here pretty quick. So watch yourself because heads are going to start to roll. We finished the reform stage. Remember I told you the French Revolution is usually divided into 3 stages: the reform stage, the radical stage, and then something called Thermidor. We finished the reform stage last time. Do you remember what caused the reform stage to come to an end? It was the invasion of France by Austria and Prussia. They had declared war against France, and they were marching on Paris. Although they only got within about 110 miles, but there we stopped at the Battle of Valmy, where the French finally turned them away. But in the meantime, they didn't know that they would win the Battle of Valmy because they've been, up at that time, hadn't won anything. The French hadn't won anything. And they decided to kill all the people in the prisons that wouldn't sign, for example, all the priests that wouldn't sign the oath of loyalty to the government. They killed all of them, probably several thousand of them, as well as a lot of other people who had expressed misgivings about the direction of the revolution. Got rid of them too because they figured if the French, or if the Austrians and the Prussians take over Paris, they'll want to know, point to the ones that were part of this thing called the French Revolution, and they'd all be done in. So they thought that's what was going to happen. So they thought they would get rid of their opposition before their opposition got rid of them. But it turns out it wasn't necessary because the Prussians and the Austrians never made it to Paris. They got to, as I said, to the Battle of Valmy, about 110 miles away. But in the meantime, they decided that they would hold elections for a new legislative body, who would then be tasked with writing a new constitution. And guess who won those elections? The radicals did. So we're now into stage 2, the radical stage. It's not going to last very long. Actually, none of them lasted very long. But as I said, things are really going to start to happen here, so watch yourself. In the anxious days before the Battle of Valmy, a crowd of armed radicals who called themselves I think I told you about the sans-culottes. These are sans-culottes, these pants. They didn't wear the knee breeches like most men did at the time because the nobility did. So they called themselves the sans-culottes, and they became kind of the radicals of the French Revolution. They wanted action, and they wanted action now. And what they did, they decided to invade the Tuileries Palace. The Tuileries Palace, you'll recall, is where the royal family was placed under arrest after the attempt to escape when they were caught at Varennes near the border with the Austrian Netherlands. And they were brought back and they were held under guard. Well, they decided to invade. This is another storming of the Tuileries Palace where the royal family was being held. This event took place on August 10th, 1792. The Swiss Guard, you know the Swiss Guard, don't you? Today they guard the Pope, and they have for centuries. Well, they would guard other royal families of Europe too, including the Bourbons of France. And these sans-culottes, they killed about 600 of them. 600 of the 900 that were assigned to protect Louis XVI, they were murdered. And by the way, if you ever visit Switzerland, the city of Lucerne, they built a monument to them sometime in the last century, maybe 2 centuries ago. These are called the Lions of Lucerne, and this commemorates the Swiss guards that were murdered by the sans-culottes on this event on August 10th, 1792. Anyway, back to the sans-culottes now. And what they did was they chased the king as he and his family decided to take refuge in the only place they thought where they could seek protection, and that is on the floor of the Legislative Assembly, who decided that it was time, okay, to lock up the royal family for their own good, for their own protection. This event is sometimes called the Insurrection of August 10th, 1792. So thereafter, they were held in what was called the Temple Prison. Whoops, too far. The Temple Prison, they were held from, they were moved there on August 13th, 1792, and they will stay there from then on. The temple is so called because it was built by the Knights Templar in the late Middle Ages. Later it was destroyed in 1808, so as not to become a place of pilgrimage for future royalists. Napoleon had something to do with ordering its destruction. The August 10th event convinced the National Assembly that further compromises with the king were useless and decreed the provisional suspension of the powers of the king. They did this, of course, with the okay of the sans-culottes. Those new elections I just mentioned were based on universal male suffrage, and that put the radicals in charge as they established a new radical unicameral legislature called the National Convention, or sometimes just called the Convention. It was composed of 850 representatives, or deputies, and they would now rule the nation from September 21st, 1792 on. And when I say universal male suffrage, you have to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, because at this point, that meant all Frenchmen at least 25 years of age, having lived in their current residence for at least a year, and you had to be gainfully employed to be able to vote. The National Convention was therefore the first French assembly elected by a suffrage without distinctions of class. Remember, the National Assembly earlier had abolished feudalism, which abolished all distinctions of class. No more lords, no more dukes, no more barons, no more counts. Everyone was a citizen, remember? The National Assembly did that way back at the beginning of the Reform stage, okay? What?
Race wasn't an issue?
No, not really. It really wasn't. It really wasn't. At least I haven't been able to read that it was. Whether or not how individuals felt about it, I don't know. I just don't know. However, as I'm trying to say, the reason why I say you got to take this with a grain of salt, it was somewhat of a sham because so many different groups were afraid to show up to vote in this election, such as the Royalists. If you were a Royalist, still favoring the king, you didn't want to show your face. The anti-Republicans, those who didn't want a republic, and also many abstained for fear of some kind of retribution from somebody. Who knows where that would come from. And the voter turnout was about what it had previously been without universal male suffrage, about 10 to 12% of the population that was eligible to vote voted. So to say that it was universal male suffrage, I don't know. But the number of eligible voters was doubled. It's just that they didn't show up to vote. Its principal task, that is, of the National Assembly, was, as I said, to write a new constitution calling for, finally, the end of the monarchy, and to replace it, they would establish a republic, ruled by elected representatives. No monarchy whatsoever. No constitutional monarch, no monarch, period. They didn't waste their time either. On the next day, on September 22nd, 1792, they established a republic, now referred to as the First Republic. The current French government is the Fifth Republic. The French count their history since the French Revolution in their republics. And we'll talk about the first. This is the first one. It's not going to last long. The second one, it's not going to last long. Third one's going to last quite a while, and so will the fourth and the fifth. But this is the First Republic. The radicals were dominated, by the sans-culottes, but there was another group that was very dominant, and they were called the Jacobins. The Jacobins were just a group of intellectuals. They were called Jacobins because they met in an old convent that was named after St. James. Jacobins. Okay, that's how they got their name. And they set about, these radicals, abolishing practically everything they did not believe in. They had been sitting there all this time, biding their time, itching to get the votes to do this, and chiding the reformers about, you shouldn't believe the king, you shouldn't give him any power at all. And now they finally had the votes, and boy, they were going to make hay while the sun was shining. And that's what they did. They abolished monarchy in any form. And they also abolished religion. They mostly were atheists. They were the inheritors of the atheist movement of the Enlightenment. And they abolished religion in any form. Hated the church, hated the Roman Catholic Church. And as a perfect example of how they did this, at least one example of how they did this, was they adopted a new calendar. Because what calendar were they using? They were using the Gregorian calendar. Well, who was Gregory? Well, he was a pope. Pope Gregory the 13th. And so they didn't want to use this Gregorian calendar, so they adopted a brand new calendar. And it's a somewhat complicated. It's sometimes called the French Revolutionary calendar, as you can see here. But sometimes it's called the Republican calendar, because it was set up by those who favored a republic. The year was divided up into 12 months of 30 days each. None of this 30 days, half September, April, June, November, all that. 31, and don't have to worry about any of that. All the months have 30 days. Each month was divided into 3 decades. They were called decades of 10 days. Not weeks, decades of 10 days. The months were named after events in nature, such as rain, snow, heat, planting, harvesting, and so forth. Here they are in French: Vendémiaire, Brumaire, Frémière, Nivose, Pluviose, Ventos, Germinal, Floreal, Prairial, Mesidor, Thermidor, and Fructidor. Okay? Those were the 12 months. The days were simply numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on, and the years were numbered with Roman numerals. So if you wanted to give a date, you would say the 28th day of Frumaire in the year 3. And it started on September 22nd, 1792. That was day 1. Okay? It was a 360-day calendar. Well, wait a minute, there are 365 days in the year, so what about the 5 days left over? Well, that's where they had all the playoffs in football. No. It was at the end of the year, and they had, it was like they were holidays. Time for feasting and having a good time. Okay?
What did they do with leap years?
They did have a leap year. They did throw in a leap year. I can't remember what it was called. They had a funny name for it. They didn't call it leap year, they called it something else, but they knew they had to fix that problem with the leap year. But let's think about this for a minute. What was the real purpose of this calendar? The real purpose was to eliminate Sunday as a day of worship. You see, that ties everybody's brain to the religious past, which they wanted to forget about, and so the church was very, very upset about this calendar, as you can well imagine. Thus destroying people's automatic recognition of religion. Workers were very upset, since it meant the day of rest happened every 10 days instead of every 7 days. So they were upset. It didn't please them very much. Napoleon finally abolished the Republican calendar on January 1st, a little over 12 years after its introduction, in 1806, as it says there in real small print. Okay? Although it did come back, it made a resurrection. In 1871, we'll study this. This isn't the only revolution that happened in France. There are a whole bunch to come. And when the Paris Commune rose up in rebellion, they brought it back. But they didn't have much success either, so they only lasted 18 days. But they thought this would be a good thing to do to bring it, because they believed in all the things that these radicals believed in during the French Revolution. So why not adopt their calendar? Sounded like a good idea at the time. Anyway, one of the things they did later, in the same vein, kind of the same vein, the leader of the Jacobins was a lawyer by the name of Robespierre, Maximilien de Robespierre, who actually never considered himself an atheist, although he certainly sided with him on many votes. He established what came to be known to replace religion and the church and all that. He established what he called the cult of the Supreme Being, which was to become the official state religion of France. It grew from the cult of reason, which de-emphasized religion and had no gods to worship, but instead was devoted to some, it's very difficult to explain this, don't ask me what it means, I have no idea. Instead, they worshipped what was called kind of an abstract form of reason, as found in the Enlightenment idea of rationalism, whatever that means. But Robespierre found this lacking himself, since he believed that reason was just a mental exercise. And how can you worship that? So he instituted the cult of the Supreme Being. Cult in French means worship. And it was a mixture of atheism and deism. Remember deism? They generally believe in God the Creator, but then God died or went somewhere else or went on a lunch break or did something else and just left the universe alone and has ever since the creation. So this is kind of the cult of the Supreme Being was kind of a mixture of atheism and deism, but it acknowledged at least the presence of some kind of spirit and an immortal human soul. It called for devotion to the state, and its greatest virtue was good citizenship. It encouraged faithfulness to democracy and to liberty. Robespierre decreed that the first celebration would be held on 20 Prairial, year 2, and that be held at the Champ de Mars. Champ de Mars is this great man-made hill that was put together, designed by the artist Jacques-Louis David, the artist of the French Revolution, and it was called the Festival of the Supreme Being. He also decreed the day of rest will be on the 10th day of each decade, and that there would be similar but smaller celebrations throughout the nation. And all the people, they would all rally around this monument here and have a good time. Many felt that what Robespierre was doing here was trying to tap into the concept of pomp and ceremony used by the Catholic Church to inculcate doctrine and obedience. But his task was a monumental one, since there was just so much religious tradition in France that it probably eventually just helped bring about his own downfall. There's no way you're going to stamp out all that tradition. Some individuals, yes, but the vast population, no. These radicals set up a powerful committee known as the Committee of Public Safety, which dominated the convention. The Committee of Public Safety succeeded the previous Committee of General Defense, established in January of 1793, and assumed its role of protecting the newly established republic against foreign attacks and internal rebellion. As wartime measure, the committee, composed at first of 9, later of 12 members, was given broad supervisory powers over the military, judicial, and legislative efforts. It was formed as an administrative body to supervise and expedite the work of the executive bodies of the convention and of the government ministers appointed by the convention. As the committee tried to meet the dangers of a coalition of European nations and counter-revolutionary forces within the country, it became more and more and more powerful, almost overnight. The most important act of the new convention, at this time, in the early going anyway, was the decision to put the king on trial for what Robespierre called, and I believe he was the first one to use this phrase, crimes against humanity. The discovery of the so-called iron chest in the Tuileries Palace on November 20th, 1792, made the trial inevitable. Documents found in this secret chest proved without any doubt the treachery of Louis XVI, since they proved that he was in correspondence with several other European monarchs urging them to invade France. When you're the king of a country and you're urging another country to invade your country, that's treason. It's pretty hard to argue any other way. The final unanimous verdict was never in doubt, since the convention, controlled by the radicals, served as the jury. Rather large jury, but they were the jury. But the vote to execute him was much, much closer. Of the 721 deputies present and voting, 387 voted for the death penalty, while 334 were opposed. 26 deputies voted for death on condition that he would be reprieved. In other words, the sentence would not be carried out. On January 18th, the question of the reprieve was put to a vote. 380 votes were cast against, 310 for. So the king's fate was sealed. His execution was set for the following Monday morning at 10 a.m. on January 21st, 1793. Having been separated from his family since the beginning of the trial, Louis sought permission to see them once more on the evening of the 20th. During his time alone, the king had composed his last will and testament with his family very much in mind. He did this, by the way, the previous Christmas. In his will, Louis addressed his own son, the Dauphin, Louis, and he urged him, and I quote, "If he has the unhappy fate of becoming king, to think that he owes himself completely to the happiness of his fellow citizens, that he must forget all hatred or resentment, and especially everything that has to do with the misfortunes and afflictions that I have suffered." That was the advice he gave him. Louis also asked his wife's forgiveness for his share of the responsibility for the humiliating state to which she had been reduced. He found the family gathering with Marie Antoinette, the Dauphin, his daughter, Madame Royale, she was called, his sister, Madame Elizabeth, so distressing that he could not bear to go through with the second final meeting arranged at Marie Antoinette's insistence for 7 a.m. on the following morning, just before his execution. The last hours of the king have been well documented. His meticulous instructions to his devoted manservant, Cléry, who had served his master's lonely life in the temple, he recorded almost everything that happened. His long drive in the mayor's coach through the silent Parisian crowds who had lined the boulevards to the Plaza of the Revolution. His own removal, he took his own coat off and his collar before his hands were bound behind his back. His final protestation of innocence was drowned out by a drum roll, and his chaplain cried, "Son of St. Louis, mount thee to heaven." And the blade descended. The blade fell, severed his head, part trophy, part proof, triumphantly held aloft by the executioner, as you can see here. The executioner holding Louis's head up here. Here's the body of Louis, the crowds gathered around. This was to serve as the final set piece of the French Revolution. It will not. Among Louis's contemporaries, National Convention deputy who voted for his execution, by the way, his name was Lazare Carnot, made perhaps the most wry statement of the day when he quipped, and I quote, "Even bad causes have their martyrs, just like good ones." Interesting comment. Let's spend a little time here talking about the guillotine. A lot of people misunderstand about the guillotine, although maybe not so much, I don't know. We think of it as this instrument of terror, which it certainly could have been, but it wasn't meant to be. It was to be a reformed, democratic, and humane method of capital punishment used by France and other European nations. Humane because it was thought to be painless. More on that in a minute. It had long been believed that beheading was the most merciful and painless manner of execution, although, as I always like to say, no one could be interviewed afterward to see if it hurt. But swinging the axe to accomplish a clean cut was a very iffy proposition at best. And some executions were indeed botched and messy affairs, whereas the strong men had to hold down the executionee while a second or sometimes third swipe was taken with the axe. And boy, I'll tell you, by then, you were not having a nice day. Up till now, methods of capital punishment were meant to be slow and painful. The idea of a merciful way to put someone to death actually hadn't occurred to anybody yet. But it did with the French Revolution. And they actually started talking about this way back during the Reform stage. In fact, remember last time or a couple of times ago I explained to you about being broken on the wheel, how they did that? When Louis heard that people were aghast at this, he banned it. He ended executions by being broken on the wheel, which was a favorite form of execution in France at the time. And previously, whether or not you got the long, slow, painful death or the quick, painless one by having your head chopped off, it often depended on what class you were. So the French Revolution, those who sponsored the French Revolution, saw the guillotine as a way of making equality. Didn't matter whether you were rich or poor, the king or a serf, everyone was going to get the quick, painless death. And it was up to a guy. They hired a doctor, a physician. I don't know if this is a violation of the Hippocratic Oath or not. We'll have to ask him. But and his name was Dr. Guillotin. It was named after him. And he would draw up a design for an instrument that would far more efficient at separating the head from the rest of the body swiftly and at the exact spot every single time. Since your neck is locked into what they call the tumbril, and then the blade would fall by simple gravity, and hopefully it would be sharp, but you know, back in those days, the quality of steel being what it was, and after 3 or 4 executions, I'll bet the blade wasn't very, sometimes the executioner had to jump on top of the blade and kind of finish the job. Finish the job. Nazi Germany used the guillotine between 1933 and 1945 when they were in charge of Germany. And they executed well over about 16,500 people. The Nazis like to execute a lot of people too. Including 10,000 of those executions took place in 1944 and 1945 alone, by which time the Nazis probably realized they were going to lose World War II. And by the way, that approximates the same number of executions during the Reign of Terror, during the French Revolution. The East German secret police, the Stasi, used it as late as 1966 for secret executions. France used it the last time in February of 1977 to execute a convicted murderer. Okay? And then they abolished capital punishment. Okay? Now, there is a rather morbid issue, unless you consider everything that I've already said it's kind of morbid, which probably is. But there is one issue. Exactly exactly how painless is it? And what's it like to have your head suddenly separated from the rest of your body?
It hurts.
Well, does it hurt or doesn't it? As I said previously, they wanted it to be painful and they wanted it to take a long time as a deterrent, because they had big crowds. I mean, it was like a holiday. And there's all those people out there in the audience watching it, the message was clear. This is what happens when you commit treason. Or this is what happens when you do whatever you shouldn't be doing. But because the guillotine was invented specifically to be humane, the issue of pain and suffering was soon seriously considered. Those who took up this issue asked the question as to how long consciousness survives after the beheading. Now, one famous legend, and I only say legend because I've used this example for years. I can't remember where I got it, and believe me, I tried for at least a week in the last 10 days to find my source, and I couldn't find it. But I know I read it somewhere, but it involves the execution during the Reign of Terror, by the way, of a French scientist whose name was Antoine Lavoisier. He was a chemist. In fact, he was a pretty famous chemist. He was involved in, see, this is an exciting time in chemistry, because up till this time, or just before this time, everyone believed there were only 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. But then they began to discover, the air is made up of several different kinds of things, like nitrogen and oxygen and so on and so forth, and the earth is made up of a whole bunch of different things, so it can't be an element, because an element is reducing something to its basic fundamental nature. Lavoisier was like Dr. Joseph Priestley was in this country, he was involved in separating oxygen from the air, which they, by the way, they had a funny name for it. They called it phlogiston. And anyway, he got himself into some trouble in 1794, like a lot of people did, and he found himself on the tumbril about to be guillotined. Anyway, as the story goes, he decided to convert his execution into a scientific experiment. He arranged for a colleague to count the number of times his eyes blinked, because he told his colleague that as soon as I hear the blade fall, I will begin to blink my eye very deliberately and very fast. How many times? Grab my head when it falls into the basket and count how many times it's still blinking. 19 times. 19 times. Okay. Anyway, a more scientific experiment took place in June of 1905. The following report was written by a Dr. Bouvereau. Dr. Bouvereau was his name, author of a book. He wrote a book on the history of the guillotine. And he observed the head of an executed prisoner by the name of Henri Languille on June 28, 1905. And here's what he said, and I quote, I'm reading from his book here. Here then is what I was able to note immediately after the decapitation. The eyelids and lips of the guillotined man worked in irregularly rhythmic contractions for about 5 or 6 seconds. This phenomenon has been remarked by all those finding themselves in the same conditions as I myself for observing what happens after the severing of the neck. I waited several seconds. The spasmodic movements ceased. It was then that I called out in a strong, sharp voice, Languille, the guy's name. I saw the eyelids slowly lift up without any spasmodic contractions. I insist advisedly on this peculiarity, but with an even movement, quite distinct and normal, such as happens in everyday life when people awaken or are torn from their thoughts. Next, Languille's eyes very definitely fixed themselves on mine, and the pupils focused themselves. I was not then dealing with sort of vague, dull look without any expression that can be observed any day in dying people to whom one speaks. I was dealing with undeniably living eyes, which were looking at me. After several seconds, the eyelids closed again. It was at that point that I called out again, and once more, without any spasm, slowly the eyelids lifted, and undeniably living eyes fixed themselves on mine, with perhaps even more penetration than the first time. Then there was a further closing of the eyelids, but now less complete. I attempted the effect a third call. There was no further movement, and the eyes took on the glazed look which they have in the dead. Unquote. So don't try this at home. Okay? Apparently, it's not as instant and perhaps as painless as thought. Who knows? Who knows? In the meantime, let's go back to the convention now, and the Jacobins in the French Revolution, led by Robespierre, took over the convention, and soon, and by the way, I had some pictures of the guillotine there. These are actually some models you can see of them. And there's Robespierre, by the way. Robespierre took over the convention and soon passed the famous law of suspects and created the equally infamous, I should say infamous instead of famous, Committee of Public Safety, as I mentioned earlier, that gave them dictatorial control over the convention and the nation. Why infamous? Because this is what brought us also the infamous Reign of Terror. During this bloody event, thousands of French men and women went to the guillotine simply because someone had accused them of being disloyal to the revolution, which was legally defined as treason. Even a comment made years before was enough to convict. The supreme irony here is that the revolution is obviously going too far. This is the problem with almost all revolutions. You see, they became absolutists in order to destroy absolutism. Always a problem with those who are building what they are convinced is a utopian world, a perfect society. They became absolutists themselves and ended up killing far more people than the Bourbons ever dreamed of. A fate also suffered by Russia, China, Cuba, Cambodia, Vietnam, North Korea, where the death toll reaches into the tens of millions. This is the universal problem with utopians. What do you do with the dissenters, with those who disagree with the direction you are moving? There are always going to be those who disagree. And of course, the answer you come up with is you kill them. They're standing in your way. They're standing between you and the perfect world that you are trying to create. And this is the principal difference between the American Revolution and the French, or the others I just mentioned. Our founding fathers were building a better world, not a perfect world. They knew a perfect world was impossible. And when our Constitution was written, they built in all those checks and balances to make government subservient to the people. Our Constitution established a decentralized federalist system with all powers not enumerated for the central government to be given to the states or local governments. All the other revolutions, including the French Revolution, set up a strong central government which took power from all other forms of government in the nation. They also built a way to amend the Constitution, knowing that circumstances may change over the years. But they wisely made it a difficult process, but not impossible. What do we have, 27 amendments? Of course, the first 10 were taken in a group, weren't they? And they made it a difficult process so that the document doesn't become an instrument blown or bit by the winds of change. One of the unfortunates in the Reign of Terror was the Queen. Marie Antoinette. On the night of August 1st, 1793, at 1 in the morning, she was transferred from the temple to an isolated cell called the Conciergerie, a building along the river, and she was given a cell, and she was given the name prisoner number 280. She was thus separated from her son and daughter and would never see them again. The Conciergerie was a prison where those awaiting execution were sent. It's like a holding tank. That's what it became anyway. Her trial began on October 14th, 1793. The Committee of Public Safety had probably already decided on the verdict. Among the accusations were orchestrating orgies in the palace at Versailles, sending millions of livres to Austria, planning the massacre of the National Guards during the storming of the Tuileries in 1792, declaring her son to be the new king of France, and incest, a charge made by her son, Louis Charles, pressured into it, doing so by the radical Jacques Hébert, who controlled him. This last accusation drew an emotional response from Marie Antoinette at her trial, who refused to respond to the charge. Instead, appealing to all the mothers present in the room, their reaction is said to have comforted her, since these women were not otherwise sympathetic to her. The inevitable death sentence was pronounced 2 days later, on October 15th, 1793. For her last journey, she dressed herself in a, this is the scene at her execution. She dressed herself in a plain white dress and bonnet. Her hair, which had been carefully groomed for her appearance before the trial, was shorn and in preparation for the guillotine's blade, and her hands were tied behind her back. She went to her death in an open cart, deprived of the relative privacy afforded to her husband, who rode, as I said earlier, in the mayor's carriage. Only her red high-heeled shoes, which miraculously, in view of the countless petty acts of cruelty inflicted on her, she had managed to hide these and hold on to them. And she wore them on her way, which was probably an act of defiance, a last act of defiance. That and her proud bearing, which was marvelously caught. There's Marie Antoinette. And there it is. On the right, you see the sketch by Jacques-Louis David. He didn't have a whole lot of time because she was going by. And the one on the left is sometimes called the chemise portrait. She was wearing a chemise, which was, I believe it was like a piece of underwear. And it was like it was shocking that the queen would be painted wearing what she's wearing there. And there are only just a few, there's less than a decade in the difference between the ages of those two women. And so she certainly aged a lot while she was in prison. Thus, the French nation took its revenge on the Austrian princess, as she was often called. Marie Antoinette never fully understood or tried to come to terms with the revolution. She was far less accommodating than the king, though far more viciously hated by their enemies. Like Louis, she achieved a degree of resignation and steadfastness in coping with her long ordeal, but at a cost. A lifetime rather than a decade seems to separate the two images you see up there. Now, Marie Antoinette's son, Louis Charles, was his name, was left to suffer in prison. The authorities were of a mind to just leave him there, since according to French monarchical tradition and law, and to most royalists, he had become King Louis XVII. At 22 minutes past 10 on the morning of January 21st, 1793, as the blade fell, decapitating his father, Louis XVI. But of course, he never reigned. There was no enthusiasm for keeping the sickly, demoralized boy alive, and on June 8th, 1795, he died of neglect at the age of 10 in the Temple prison where he had spent the previous 3 years of his life. During the autopsy, the physician was shocked to see the countless scars which covered the body of Louis Charles. The scars were the result of the physical abuse the poor child had suffered while imprisoned in the temple. Louis Charles was buried on the 10th of June in the nearby Sainte Marguerite Cemetery, but no stone was erected to mark the spot. A skull was found there in 1846 and identified as his, though later re-examination in 1893 showed it to be from a teenager, therefore it was unlikely to be his. There was a tradition at the time when royals die, this happened in England too, there was a custom in England also, that they had probably brought over from Normandy, but when a king dies, the heart was cut out and buried separately. And the heart of Louis Charles was removed by the overseeing physician of his autopsy and was not interred with the rest of the body. The doctor stored it, the smuggled heart, in distilled wine in order to preserve it. However, after 8 to 10 years, the distilled wine had evaporated and the heart was further kept dry from then on to prevent further decomposition. The relic spent the next century or so being passed around and finally was interred at Saint-Denis, the final resting place of French monarchies, French royalty, on June 8th, 2004, just 15 years ago, which was the first time in over a century that a royal ceremony took place in France. In fact, the reign of terror proved fatal to most all of the royal family, and even those who associated closely with them. For example, the mistress of Louis XV, the Madame du Barry, and even the magistrate who defended the king at his trial were sent to the guillotine for their association of the king. The king's sister, Madame Elizabeth, was executed in the spring of 1794. Only the daughter, Marie-Therese Charlotte, or Madame Royale, as she was called, survived the revolution. She survived because of a negotiated prisoner exchange with the Austrians for some revolutionaries that were held by the Austrians. She died in 1851. The king and queen also, a lot of people don't realize this, also adopted 4 children during their marriage. One was a Senegalese slave boy who was adopted, freed, baptized, and given a place with rent paid by the royal family in Paris. After their imprisonment, he was evicted and is believed to have probably starved to death on the streets of Paris. The others were orphans of servants who had died while serving the royal family, and it is believed that they may have survived the revolution, although there's no real proof. There were also 2 leading members of the king's family did survive, but only because they escaped the country in the nick of time. These were the king's 2 younger brothers. The elder of the 2 was the Count of Provence, or Louis Stanislas Xavier, and the younger was the Count of Artois, Charles Philippe. We shall encounter both of them later. Back to the revolution. Soon, almost everyone grew tired of the Jacobins and Robespierre, who within a few months were sending their own friends to the guillotine. So the convention passed a measure to execute Robespierre, which they did on July 28, 1794. It is estimated that somewhere between 200 and 300 per day were executed throughout France during the terror. Or between June of 1793 and the end of July 1794, there were 16,594 official death sentences in France, of which 2,639 were in Paris. Now, although I should mention that these numbers are in dispute. You can read 10 books and probably find 8 different numbers. Some estimates nationwide going well into the hundreds of thousands, but who knows? But anyway, the execution of Robespierre ends the radical phase of the French Revolution. Okay? Boy, those radicals did a lot, didn't they? Okay? So, a lot of people. without further ado, let's, what we're going to do now, we'll take our break. And then we'll come back and talk about the wars of the French Revolution that have been going on during this whole time. Okay? So see you in, how about 15 minutes? About 5 after the hour? Okay, the wars of the French Revolution. While all these major events were going on in the Revolution that I've been talking about, there's still some more to come. France soon found itself at war with almost all of Europe. In addition to several very significant revolts in the south and the west of France that caused a considerable strain on the armed forces of the nation. From the time of the attempted escape and arrest of the king, and then certainly his execution, the crowned heads of Europe, the other crowned heads of Europe, began to agree that this French Revolution thing was a very dangerous thing to their own health and well-being. Ironically, however, many of the commoners living in those same nations admired the revolution and felt it was going to mean the liberation of the lower classes who had likewise been oppressed for centuries by their own absolute monarchs. So many people don't understand. When Napoleon marched on Europe, the crowds cheered him. The crowds of the people he just conquered cheered him, but those were the lower classes cheering him, saw him as a liberator. Interestingly, even the leaders of the French Revolution differed among themselves about whether or not these wars were a good thing or a bad thing. Moderates generally saw the wars as a way to export revolution throughout Europe that would eventually lead to peace as one by one foreign despots would be toppled. Conservative royalists supported it, hoping the French would lose, that there would be a French defeat, and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy would put an end to all this madness. Liberals and radicals saw the wars as extremely dangerous and as a major threat to the revolution should the Allied powers defeat France, so their support for the wars matched the ebb and flow of successes and failures on the battlefield. These wars began when France declared war preemptively on Austria and Prussia back in April of 1792. I already talked about this when we were talking about the reform stage. At first, things went horribly for the Allied armies, who were looking for an excuse, marched into France on their way to Paris to liberate Louis XVI. But after the previously mentioned Battle of Valmy, things went better for France, who soon marched north into the Netherlands, which brought Britain and Spain into the wars against France. Then things went badly for a while until universal conscription, or as the French called it, the levée en masse, as a new form of promoting officers took effect and turned the tide almost totally on the side of France from then on, or at least until 1812. The first conscription decree in February of 1793 called for 300,000 to be drafted. But in August of that same year, an additional decree called for the drafting of all able-bodied young men. The new method of promoting officers, I just mentioned, repudiated the old medieval presumption that only members of nobility were capable of leading men into battle. Why? Because they had noble blood flowing through their veins. And one of the reasons noble blood was superior to common blood was because it included this skill, or so it was believed. The new method required officers to work their way up through the ranks, proving by actual performance and success under fire that they had what it takes regardless of the social position of their fathers. It soon became obvious that this new method produced better leaders. And with these new officers and the swelling ranks of the army due to the draft, the French began to win battles. And it will take half a century or so for the rest of Europe to catch on. The Allied coalitions arrayed against France tended to break up as they argued amongst themselves and signed separate treaties, leaving France with a great amount of conquered territory, most of which was converted into satellite states or ersatz republics, numbering, by the way, well over 150. So they had some success. The Rhineland and all of Holland would fall into this category. Only Britain and Austria remained at war throughout this period, and only Britain afterward, since Austria will capitulate. Composer Claude-Joseph Roger composed a stirring little march that became the anthem, became the favorite of the provincial volunteers from the southern port of Marseille. And therefore, they named this march the Marseillaise. And of course, today it's the French national anthem. Let's play a little bit of the... Come on. The Marseillaise, okay? A stirring national anthem, you have to admit, okay? And the words are even more stirring. You know, our national anthem has been criticized for being born in warfare and violence and of violence. Well, listen to the French, listen to the words of the Marseillaise here. Arise, children of the fatherland. The day of glory has come. Against us tyranny's bloody flag is raised. In the countryside do you hear the roaring of these fierce soldiers. They come into our arms to slit the throats of our sons and our women. To arms, citizens, to arms. Form your battalions. March on, march on. May their impure blood water our fields. Sorry about that. Well, anyway, it stuck. And the Marseillaise, by the way, will become not only the national anthem of France, but it'll become the national anthem of radical revolutionaries well into the 20th century. The Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution will adopt the Marseillaise as their march too. Okay? Anyway, the wars of the French Revolution morphed into the Napoleonic Wars as Napoleon took charge of the French nation and the military and utilized his military genius to make war on virtually all of Europe. We'll pick up on that story when we get to Napoleon, which is soon. Generally, the wars of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars involve 7 separate, distinct coalitions of nations allied against France. Most historians divide these 7 coalitions into 2 categories. By counting the War of the First Coalition as part of the French Revolutionary Wars, and the rest are part of the Napoleonic Wars. The War of the First Coalition, so let's take the first one first. Always a good idea. The War of the First Coalition actually has already been briefly discussed. at least the first part of it. This involves France's declaration of war on Austria and Prussia that brought about the invasion of France by these two nations in 1792. But the invaders were defeated at the Battle of Valmy. Here's one of the, I don't know if this is David or not that painted this one, but this is the Battle of Valmy that ended that threat. But as previously discussed, in January of 1793, the French executed Louis XVI. This united practically all of Europe, including Spain, Naples, and the Netherlands, against the revolution. France also declared war against Britain and the Netherlands on February 1st, 1793, and soon afterwards against Spain. In the course of the year 1793, the Holy Roman Empire, the kings of Portugal, Naples, and the Grand Duke of Tuscany also declared war against France. This is all part of the War of the First Coalition and brought about the already discussed 1793 decrees calling for universal conscription in order to create an armed force of several 100,000 men to meet the threat. The Austrians were the first to taste defeat after losing 4 major battles on both banks of the Rhine, and with the French taking back land seized earlier by the Austrians in their march through northeastern France on their way to Paris. In 1794, the French took all of Belgium and the Rhineland, which is on the right bank of the Rhine, or the eastern bank of the Rhine. The Prussians were also driven out of eastern France, and by the end of the year had retired from the war. Against Spain, the French made successful incursions into both Catalonia and Navarre. In the West Indies, the British fleet successfully captured Martinique, St. Lucia, and Guadeloupe, although a French fleet arrived later that year and recovered Guadeloupe from the British. After seizing the Low Countries in a surprise winter attack, France was able to impose surrender terms on the Dutch, forcing them to give up territory south of the Rhine. In 1796, France launched a 2-pronged attack into Central Europe. One army attacked across the Rhine, and another from Italy under the leadership of a newly promoted Corsican artillery officer working his way up through the ranks by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. Both were wildly successful, with Napoleon capturing Milan and laying siege to Mantua, capturing it in February of 1797. Both armies linked up and marched on Vienna, the capital of Austria, but did not capture it. That will happen later. Soon, Austria sued for peace. During this year, the French actually, though unsuccessfully, landed an army in Wales, led by an Irish American by the name of William Tate. But in February, Tate was forced to surrender, marking the only battle fought on British soil during these wars. Austria signed the Treaty of Campo Formio in October, ceding Belgium, and here's a map that kind of talks about some of these areas. This whole area up here is was Belgium. See, Brussels is right here, and so forth. Ceding Belgium to France and recognizing French control of the Rhineland and much of Italy, much of northern Italy, was under the control of France, and that had previously been part of the Holy Roman Empire. The ancient Republic of Venice was partitioned between Austria and France, setting the stage for another war. The treaty also mentioned dozens of other areas. You see them all colored in here. Too many to mention, but the areas in of Italy and the German states along the Rhine were ceded to France. This ended the War of the First Coalition, although Great Britain and France remain technically still at war. But don't worry, there's still a lot more war to come when Napoleon decides to march on Europe. All of these battles and wars were fought while all the events so far discussed in the French Revolution were going on at the same time. Hard to talk about so many different things going on at the same time, it gets confusing. So let's move on to the third stage of the French Revolution, third and final stage of the French Revolution, which is called the Thermidorian reaction. As mentioned earlier, on 9 Thermidor in the year 2, which would be July 27th, 1794 on the Gregorian calendar, Maximilien Robespierre was finally denounced by members of the National Convention as a tyrant, leading to Robespierre and 21 of his associates being arrested that night and beheaded the following day. As mentioned earlier, this event ended the radical phase of the revolution. Moderate conservatives now took over and set up a new, more conservative government that was called the Directory. Since these events occurred during the month of Thermidor on the Republican calendar, which would be equivalent to like July on the Gregorian calendar, it's Thermidor means heat. In reaction to the horrific events of the Reign of Terror, historians have called it the Thermidorian reaction, and it is the last phase of the revolution. We should have a moment of silence for those that have not survived to this point. Historian Crane Brinton, who revolution is his favorite topic to write about, he defined Thermidor as, and I quote, the ensuing slow and uneven return to quieter, less heroic times, unquote. This term has been applied to many revolutions since almost all revolutions have experienced a conservative reaction. Brinton goes on to say that the period is usually marked by the appearance of a tyrant. We know who this is in France. In England, it was Cromwell during their revolt. In Russia, it was Lenin and Stalin. In China, it was Mao. And in the United States, it was Washington. Well, at least the Jeffersonians, at times anyway, considered Washington and his pal Hamilton to be tyrants. That's why when Washington retired from government after serving his 2 terms as president, even the King of England, George III, whom he defeated, you might say, in the Revolutionary War, called him, and I quote, the greatest man that will ever live, unquote. Because he could have been king of the world, the king of America, but he didn't. He retired. So let's talk about this directory, which isn't going to last too long. The basis of this new government was a new constitution, the third one of the revolution, that they had one in 1791, one in 1793, and now 1795, drafted by the convention, called the Constitution of the Year 3, or 1795 in Gregorian terms. It was ratified by a popular vote of over 20 to 1, a ratio of over 20 to 1 yes ratio. The new constitution took effect on September 27, 1795. The Directory set up a government with a bicameral or 2-house legislature. The 2 houses were called the Council of 500 and the Council of Ancients. And 5 directors representing the executive branch, hence it's being called the Directory. They were all elected by 20,000 of the richest men in France, since the idea of universal male suffrage had gone by the wayside. The directors could only be replaced individually, one at a time, but 1/3 of the 2 councils were replaced each year. So they were kept weak. Almost from the beginning, the Directory faced several problems. War and its cost ruined the economy, now beset with explosive inflation. Here is a chart that shows the declining value of the assignat, which declined to practically worth nothing by 1796. In fact, it's the problem with paper money. It was so bad that the directors once voted a resolution to take their salary in cheese instead of money. I guess at least you can eat the cheese. There were 4 major coups d'etat between 1795 and 1799 that occurred every time one of the directors threatened to take over. Riots and violence against the government were numerous, since just about everyone from the right and left opposed the new government, to the point where the Directory reluctantly hired one of its best generals to protect it from the many Parisian mobs. Unfortunately, they failed to appreciate the ambition of one of them, as the young upstart from Corsica named Napoleon Bonaparte. So I guess this is probably as good a time as any to start dealing with the man who will not only bring an end to the French Revolution, but also put his stamp on European history that will last for the next 100 years. Napoleon Bonaparte. Those were his birth and death dates. Let's start by summarizing his career here real quick. Here's a famous portrait of him by Jacques-Louis David. One of the most famous directors of the Directory was the loose-living and corrupt Paul Barras, who knew Napoleon because the young general fell in love with one of his former mistresses. In fact, he introduced them to each other, the beautiful and talented Josephine de Beaucanaise. A widowed mother of two, her husband, by the way, had been guillotined, who grew up on a sugar plantation in Martinique, which explains her rotten teeth. Napoleon married Josephine, and Barras, almost as a wedding gift, gave Napoleon command of the French army in Italy. That's where he went off and started winning all those victories in Italy, probably to just get him out of France. While away in Italy, during the War of the First Coalition just discussed, Napoleon proved himself quite adept at not only military strategy, but also at writing love letters to his new love, many of which have survived to today. You know, guys, the reason men don't write love letters, or if they do, if men get a love letter, they read it and throw it away. If women get a love letter, they lock them up in some box someplace and lock it away forever so that somebody else can come along and read them. So here, let me read to you a few passages from some of Napoleon's love letters to Josephine. Okay? For example, in one of them he wrote, "I awake full of you. Your image and the memory of last night's intoxicating pleasures has left no rest to my senses." Pretty good, huh? Pretty good. Or this one he wrote after departing for Italy, and of course these are all quotes. "You to whom nature has given spirit, sweetness, and beauty, you who alone can move and rule my heart, you who know all too well the absolute empire you exercise over it." Pretty good, huh? But then I'll have a few more later on. But then, soon after Napoleon's departure, Josephine started an affair with a handsome cavalry lieutenant, which Napoleon soon discovered, and the newsletters abruptly stopped. The love letters abruptly stopped. In Italy, the French army was engaged in a stalemate fighting Austria, who controlled most of northern Italy, but soon Napoleon had the Austrians on the run, so he crossed the Alps, and this is David's painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps. Pretty amazing. I mean, you don't need to hire a PR man when you've got somebody painting portraits like this of you. And I do hope the horse was actually a little larger than that. You know, carrying him up over those mountains would be tough. And he invaded Austria, defeating them, which made him very popular at home. Too popular as far as Barras was concerned, because so he next put him in charge of all the an ill-fated expedition to Egypt and the Middle East, where he fought the British, winning a spectacular victory over them in the Battle of the Pyramids. But when the British Admiral Lord Nelson destroyed his fleet and his supply line, he was forced to return to France. He returned dismayed because his wife, who had been unfaithful to him, and the British had intercepted some of his love letters and sent them on to London for publication in the Morning Chronicle, which must be a forerunner of the notorious British tabloid press. He will later divorce her in 1810 and marry an Austrian princess. Napoleon soon recognized the flagrant ineptness of the Directory, so he overthrew it in the famous coup d'etat of 18 Brumaire. Here's one painting, and here's kind of a sketch of the same thing. That's Napoleon there. This is kind of a caricature drawing of him overthrowing the Directory. And so the Directory comes to an end. There are Most historians use this event to end their chapter on the French Revolution, since it ended the third phase, the Thermidorian reaction, and sent political events off entirely on a new direction. So for all intents and purposes, we're pretty much through with that. Here's the other painting of the overthrow of the Directory. That's Napoleon right in the middle there. Eventually, Napoleon made himself emperor in 1804. And this is David's painting, although there's another painting by Delacroix of the same event. And here's Napoleon. Here's Josephine. Here's the Pope that he had brought to, virtually kidnapped from Rome for the event. There are a couple of anecdotes connected to this event. One concerns the actual crowning of Napoleon. Two separate crowns were brought for the ceremony, a golden laurel wreath recalling the Roman Empire and a replica of Charlemagne's crown of Christmas Day of the year 800. Napoleon entered the ceremony already wearing the laurel wreath, which he put on his own head and kept it on his head throughout the proceedings. For the official coronation, he raised the Charlemagne crown over his own head in a symbolic gesture, but never placed it on top of his head because he was already wearing the golden wreath. Instead, he placed the crown on Josephine's head, declaring her Empress of France. The Pope was virtually ordered to come to Paris, as I said, but as it turns out, he was there to provide window dressing only for the event. The legend that Napoleon grabbed the crown from the Pope is highly questionable, but some say it did happen. Actually, Napoleon did crown himself since he put the gold laurel on his head before the ceremony began. Another question concerning this event is, why did he do it? That is, besides the obvious reason for more power and prestige, well, since he had become first consul right after the coup of 18 Brumaire, there had been several assassination attempts against his life. One historian reports that there were between 20 and 30 such assassination attempts. There was no guarantee that should he die suddenly, which one of his relatives would become the new ruler of France. So making himself emperor gave him the traditional right or practice of naming his successor. Actually, he ordered a plebiscite on the issue of his becoming emperor, and it passed with 99% of the vote. So that there was no doubt that it would, at least for now, so many people were sick and tired of the many violent turns of the revolution, they welcomed a despot who would take over and keep things on an even keel. And by the way, there were over 3.5 million votes cast in that plebiscite. Now his ambition would be released on all of Europe. And all of Europe will declare war on him, as I said before, in what we now call the Napoleonic Wars of 1799 to 1815. Obviously, this would be an expensive undertaking, which led to an interesting little contact with the new upstart nation across the sea, the infant United States of America. But let's go back a little in order to tell this whole story. In the spring of 1682, while canoeing down the Mississippi River, French explorer René Robert de La Salle claimed the territory for King Louis XIV of France, naming it Louisiana, a territory much larger than our state of Louisiana. This is the French colony of Louisiana. Pretty good chunk of land. This is the infant United States. Still some territories here. 80 years later, France was obliged to cede this territory to Spain as a result of the 7 Years' War. It also had to give up its other North American holdings in Great Britain due to being defeated in the same war. Then in 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte reclaimed the territory in exchange for placing the Spanish king's son-in-law on the throne of one of those small, newly created kingdoms in Italy called Etruria, located on the Tuscan coastline of northern Italy. Napoleon also received 6 warships to sweeten the deal. Spain and France agreed upon this in a secret treaty known as the Treaty of San Ildefonso. However, soon enough, the signing of the treaty became public knowledge, causing the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, a great deal of consternation. Ever since 1795, a treaty between the United States and Spain had ensured that American farmers and merchants could use the Mississippi River for transporting goods. They could also store these goods at the mouth of the river in a quaint little town named after the regent of Louis XV, the Duke of Orleans, or we call it New Orleans, without having to pay any export duties whatsoever. These agreements would most likely be revoked once the cash-strapped Napoleon took over Louisiana. Therefore, the Americans began to debate the idea of going to war with the French in order to preserve this valuable trade route. They even outfitted thousands of men ready to fight at a moment's notice. However, slave rebellions, yellow fever, wintry conditions proved to be heavy obstacles in the implementation of their plans. Therefore, Jefferson gave up on the idea of going to war with the French. Instead, he requested that Napoleon sell him certain territories. Toward this end, he sent two negotiators, Minister Robert Livingston and Special Envoy James Monroe, to France. The U.S. was ready to pay just over $9 million for the purchase of Florida and the city of New Orleans. As it turned out, the Americans did not have to negotiate much. Unknown to all concerned, Napoleon had grown tired of France's North American possessions. A successful slave revolt in Haiti drained resources of the French military, who had no success against that rebellion. So Napoleon himself suggested that he would sell all of Louisiana to the Americans for a total of $15 million, which included an American forgiveness of a French debt of $3.75 million. After Livingston retrieved his mouth from the floor, upon hearing the French offer, he quickly surmised that although he was not authorized to make this deal, he knew he couldn't pass it up. Although there was some opposition, for example, the Senate vote ratifying the treaty was 24-7. Most of the opposition centered around the constitutionality of what had just taken place. Normally, strict constructionist Jefferson loosely interpreted the president's treaty powers as sufficient to make his actions legal. Napoleon planned to use the money to invade Britain, which of course never happened for reasons that we'll get into later. Therefore, the United States paid $3 million in gold and sold bonds to raise the rest of the money. Two European banks, one British and one Dutch, helped underwrite the payments. Thus, Louisiana Purchase was completed, virtually doubling the size of the United States. So this was the United States before, and now you add this whole territory right here. After. Okay. One of history's greatest real estate deals. We bought 828,000 square miles for $15 million, or about $18 a square mile. It included land from 15 present U.S. states and 2 Canadian provinces. Now anyway, now back to Napoleon. The Napoleonic Wars will make Napoleon a legend and put him in the books as one of the greatest military geniuses of all time. Just look at the map of Europe that resulted from his many conquests. Anything that's in purple, both dark and light, was for all intents and purposes part of Napoleon's empire. Purple. Okay? Pretty amazing, huh? But most conspicuous on this map is Britain. He knew that to defeat Britain, you had to destroy their navy, because Britannia rules the waves, as the song says. But he lost the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 to Admiral Horatio Nelson, in which 33 French and Spanish ships were destroyed by 27 British ships. The French and Spanish lost several thousand dead and the loss of many ships. The British lost no ships, but 458 dead, one of which, by the way, was their commander, Admiral Nelson, who was shot by a French sharpshooter and returned to London and given a hero's funeral and rests at the basement of St. Paul's Cathedral. And of course, in downtown London, there's the famous Trafalgar Square, and this is a, what do you call it, a panoramic picture of it. And the big column in the middle has Admiral Nelson at the top. This battle saved Britain from Napoleon. And by the way, to get him back to the, because he was dead, they put him in a cask of brandy to preserve the body, because they wanted to give him a state funeral. And when they got back to London, they drank the brandy. And one of those who did so was apparently a wine snob, because he remarked at how full-bodied the brandy was. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Here's a picture of Lord Nelson at the top. One of Britain's greatest battles, the Battle of Trafalgar. And that's why they named one of the largest squares in London, Trafalgar Square. Napoleon next tried to defeat Britain by using indirect economic warfare, which is sometimes referred to by historians as the continental system. Because if you'll notice this map, notice how much of Europe's coastline Napoleon controlled. Okay, you got to skip over Portugal here. Almost all of Europe's coastline is controlled by Napoleon. That means all the ports. Okay? So, he simply closed all of those European ports to British trade, hoping this would bring Britain to its knees. Economic warfare. This hurt the European ports more than it hurt the British, who just took their business elsewhere. That's the nice thing about controlling the oceans of the world. If you get hemmed in someplace, you can always take your business elsewhere. You're free to do that. Although they did have to endure some economic hardship and got tangled up in another war with those pesky 13 colonies in America that had now become the United States of America, known as the War of 1812. But we won, or actually we kind of tied that war. And remember, they burnt the White House to the ground. The British did in that war. And the biggest battle we won, the Battle of New Orleans, was fought actually 10 days after the war was over. We had already decided on a peace agreement, but you can't get the word out, so they fought the battle anyway. Anyway, and we also got our national anthem in this war. Baltimore lawyer named Francis Scott Key. Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, okay, during a war. And you know what else Francis Scott Key did? He was later hired to defend a man who tried to assassinate President Jackson. And you know what his defense was? The insanity defense. He invented the insanity defense, okay? Which is very often not successful, but sometimes it is, okay? Now, the Portuguese were also a threat to this continental system, so Napoleon invaded the Iberian Peninsula, including Spain. But when the British sent their commander, Sir Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, it turned into a little war, or in Spanish, guerrilla. The Spanish word for war is guerra, but in Spanish they have this thing called the diminutive. Ventana is window, but a small window is ventanilla. So guerra is war, but guerrilla is little war. It doesn't have anything to do with the animal that lives in the highlands of Africa, okay? Which some people think it does. But when Tsar of Russia, Alexander I, broke his previous agreement to likewise boycott England, Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812. A disastrous campaign of 1812. Shows the line of battle all the way to Moscow. The Russians used the same tactic they will use against Hitler 130 years later, strategic retreat while laying waste to anything in the invader's path to deprive him of winter shelter and provisions. Unlike the Germans in World War II, however, the French did make it to Moscow. But soon a fire broke out of mysterious origin, destroyed about 80% of the city, and Napoleon was forced to retreat due to lack of food and shelter. Napoleon's 600,000 strong Grand Army, as he called it, lost 580,000 men, or 98% of his army, in the frozen snows of Western Russia and Poland during this disastrous retreat. Napoleon was no match for what the Russians called General Winter. Although, actually, the real cold temperatures did not occur until late in the retreat. In 1880, Russian composer Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky wrote his famous 1812 Overture, a popular choice at American 4th of July fireworks presentations, and I won't play that one for you, but you know the 1812 Overture, okay? It had actually canon written onto the script to be played during the orchestra playing the number. Soon all of Europe formed yet another coalition. This is the sixth one against him, and after several horrible defeats, he was forced to abdicate after his generals mutinied, and he was sent to the island of Elba off the coast of Italy. He escaped and returned to France for 100 days, only to be defeated at Waterloo on June 18th, 1815, by the 7th Coalition. He was then sent to permanent exile to the island of St. Helena in the middle of the South Atlantic, right here. There'll be no escape from that. Where he died in 1821, it was now thought to be stomach cancer, although there is controversy as to what his exact cause of death was. In 1840, his remains were returned to France, and he was entombed at the Invalides military base in Paris. And here's a picture of Napoleon's tomb that's in that church. It's down below. You see the people. See the people looking down on it here. Pretty nice final resting place, huh? And the other interesting thing is, this is Nelson's tomb. It's in the basement of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, as is Arthur, the Duke of Wellington's. And the amazing thing about this, who got the best looking sarcophagus, coffin, tomb? Well, obviously Napoleon did. But the thing is, here are the winners. And this is the loser. Go figure. Go figure. I guess the French just have a better way of they got that way, well, they just have a way of doing it, okay?
There was a lot of wars.
Yeah, there were a lot of wars, that's true. And by the way, not only is Napoleon buried there, there are, maybe hundreds of famous war heroes in France's history, also at the Invalides. The problem with the term Napoleonic Wars implies that Napoleon was the instigator in every major military campaign of the period, while of course it is true that if there were no Napoleon, there would be no Napoleonic Wars, but that's not the whole story. The wars of this period go on, and I think we will probably stop there. I want to discuss some of the results of Napoleon's rule, but it's getting late, And I think we'll reconvene on March 5th. March 5th, 2 weeks hence.